Okay, here, a video about density. We're going to talk about what density is, how something can have more or less density, what that means about whether or not it'll float, and we'll talk about the assumption that things have a constant density. So first of all, density is the amount of mass in a given amount of space or volume. So some people call this the mass to volume. Let me try that again. The mass to volume ratio. That's what density is. Density does not have its own special unit, but it's given the symbol d, and we can give mass and volume the symbols m and v, and so we can summarize the equation like that. Substances are more dense if they have more mass in a given amount of space. This can be accomplished in a couple of ways. One, the particles that make up the substance may be closer together. A good example here would be cold and hot air. When air is cold, the individual particles that make up the air occupy less space than when it's hot. Those same particles, moving a little bit faster, expand to a larger space. What that means then is we have more mass per volume here, and we have less mass per volume here when the air is hotter. This is why we get convection. This is why this hot air rises above this cold air, or floats, because it is less dense. We can also get a higher density by the individual particles that make up the substance being heavier. So for example here, if we imagine iron versus lead, the mass of an individual iron particle is about 56 grams, 56, relative to the mass of a lead, which is about 207. That's for an individual particle, and those numbers are just relative to each other. I was going to say grams, but it's not really in grams, it's in relative units. At any rate, this is obviously much higher than this, which means the individual particles of lead are themselves much heavier than the individual particles of iron. This means that lead is more dense. Now, how does this all relate to floating? Well, water has a standard density of 1 gram per milliliter, which means every 1 milliliter of water you get, it has a mass of about 1 gram. If the density of an object is less than 1 gram per milliliter, that means that it is not as heavy in the same unit volume as the water, which will make it float. If it's greater than 1 gram per milliliter, that means it has more matter in the same amount of space, or more mass in the same amount of space, which means it will sink. So that's how density relates to floating. And finally, the last note I wanted to make here is about the idea of constant density. We've been talking about all these materials, like normal materials are going to have a constant density, but we need to be careful. If we imagine something like a piece of wood, the density of that piece of wood is not going to be constant. if there's a knot in the wood, that area of the wood will have a higher density than if there's no knots in that part of the wood. So some things, like liquids and gases, tend to have fairly constant densities, and pure metals tend to have fairly constant densities, but more complex material, like organic material, because it varies throughout the substance, is unlikely to have a constant density. So we can define the density of a substance, but we should be aware that it may not be constant, and there may be a degree of variability with it. I'm going to follow this video up with some just numerical examples of how we can determine the density of a couple different situations. But that, in general, is the definition.